You and I are alone in this, so I will not dress it up for you. I've had a long life of keeping my mouth shut at the right times, and if I am speaking now, it is because silence has finally begun to cost me more than speech. My hands are old. They tremble when I lift a cup, and my hearing plays tricks. Some days a kettle seems to sing like a distant choir. Other days a man can call my name from the doorway, and I catch only the shape of his lips. Yet there is one sound my body remembers with a faith my mind cannot undo, the hush of earth falling onto wood, not as a single thud, but as a patient, repeated brushing, grain by grain, like someone sifting flour over a table. You may think you know what it means to be afraid of death. Most people do. They fear the last breath, the leaving. I tell you this so you understand me. The thing that cracked my life was not dying. It was being treated as though I had already done it while I was still in my skin. There are words for such fears. Learned men coin them the way they coin medals. But I did not need a word. I needed air. I am an old woman now, born in the year 1838, and I have outlived nearly everyone who would argue with my memory. That makes a person dangerous in a quiet way. When no one is left to correct you, you must correct yourself, or you become a liar without noticing. So I will be careful. If I stumble over a season or a day of the week, forgive it. The spine of the tale is firm, even if the small ribs shift. I will begin where the habit began, before any coffin, before any grave, because you need to know what kind of household raises a girl who learns to distrust stillness. My mother kept our kitchen as if cleanliness were a religion and dirt the devil. Lye soap boiled on the stove until the whole room smelled sharp and medicinal, and my eyes would sting while she stirred the pot with a spoon that never touched food again. When I was small enough to be lifted with one arm, she would press my cheek to her shoulder and say, not unkindly, "Hold your breath when you pass the bucket." She did not mean it as poetry. She meant it as instruction. We lived near the river, where the air was damp in summer and the cold in winter went straight through wool and bone. People worked with their backs, their hands, their knees. The men hauled and mended and built. The women scrubbed and cooked and kept accounts that never seemed to add up. Children learned early that a body was useful until it was not. When it became not, it became a burden, and burdens had to be managed with speed because the living still needed bread the next day. There was no grand talk of medical science in our rooms, not the way you might imagine. There were doctors, yes, men with black bags and firm voices, but even they were bound by what the town could pay and what the roads would allow. In bad weather, a doctor might arrive late. In hard times, he might not arrive at all. Women did what women have always done. They watched, they listened, they smelled sickness before it could name itself. My first understanding that a person could be mistaken for something else came from a neighbor's child. A boy with hair the color of wheat went under the river ice one winter. They pulled him out, blue as a plum, and laid him on the kitchen table. Someone rubbed his arms, someone slapped his feet, someone prayed. I remember the sound of boots on our floorboards as men came and went, bringing breath with them like a draft. Then, after a time, there was a peculiar calm, the calm of people deciding they have done enough. They covered his face. They began to speak in the past tense. It was my aunt, my mother's sister, who made the trouble. She had a temper that could startle even grief. "You cover him," she snapped, "and you'll never know whether he was coming back." She tore the cloth away and put her ear near his mouth. She did not hear anything, but she forced them to wait. They waited until the candle burned low and the wax ran thick. He did not return. Still, that night planted a thorn in my mother's mind. She began to say, "Whenever someone died, let them rest where we can see them. Let the earth wait a little." It is a small sentence, but it changes the way you look at a quiet body. It makes you watch the chest, the throat, the fingertips. It makes you read signs like scripture, the bluish tint, the cooling skin, the slack jaw. It makes you fear the tricks of fever and fainting fits. And in those years, fainting was not a rare thing. Women fainted from heat, from hunger, from news, from corsets drawn too tight, from childbirth that stole their blood. Men collapsed from drink, from exhaustion, from the sudden stillness that follows a blow to the head. People were declared gone with a confidence that was sometimes no more than tiredness dressed up as certainty. So you see, I was raised with a kind of double sight. I believed in God, and I believed in the body's stubbornness. I believed a soul could leave, and I believed a body could deceive you before it did. That is the sort of belief that does not announce itself until it is tested. I was not a dramatic girl. I did not chase trouble. I did not creep into graveyards to thrill my friends, though some girls did. I was plain in my wants, to be useful, to be loved, to keep my mother from worry, to keep my father from drinking more than he could afford. I worked where I was put. I learned the language of chores, the honest language of counting, of measuring, of carrying. If you wish to know what I look like, I can give you what memory gives me. Dark hair that refused to lie flat, hands rougher than a girl's hands ought to be, and a small scar on my left palm from a needle that snapped when I was hemming a shirt in poor light. The year it happened, the year my life split into before and after, began in an ordinary way. There was talk of a new line of rail farther north, and men argued whether it would bring prosperity or only strangers. There was a spring flood that left mud in the streets and ruined more than one cellar of potatoes. There were sermons about humility and work. There was laughter, too. Do not think the past is all solemn. We laughed until our ribs hurt, and then we went back to scrubbing. I remember very clearly the feel of that late summer air before I fell ill. It had a sweetness, like bruised apples. The river smelled low and warm. My mother was making preserves, and the boiling fruit threw up a steam that stuck to the walls and to my hair. I'd been awake since before dawn, carrying water, wiping jars, keeping flies away. My legs felt steady. My mind felt steady. I was proud of how little I complained. And then, as if someone had turned a key inside my spine, I began to shiver. At first, I thought it was only the morning chill clinging to me. But the sun climbed and the shaking did not stop. My teeth clicked together. My mother put her hand on my forehead and drew it back as if the skin had burned her. She stared at me with a look I had seen on her face only twice before. Once when my brother fell from a ladder, and once when my father came home with blood on his sleeve and would not say whose. "Go to bed," she said, and her voice had no room for argument. I went. I lay down. I told myself it would pass because youth is arrogant that way. But the heat came in waves, and with it a strange heaviness, as though my limbs were filling with sand. The room tilted. The ceiling swam. Voices drifted in and out of reach as if I were listening from underwater. If you have ever been very ill, you know the peculiar bargain you make. You will do anything, anything at all, for one clean breath of ease. I made that bargain without words. I remember thinking of the boy on the table under the cloth. I remember my mother's sentence, "Let the earth wait a little," and feeling, with a sudden sharpness, that I had never truly understood why she said it. Not yet. Not until the fever took my voice and left me still. When the fever first stole my voice, I did not understand that it had also begun to steal time. I would wake for a moment, one bright pinprick in a long cloth of darkness, and then I would be gone again. The bedclothes felt too heavy, then suddenly too light, as if someone had lifted them away. My skin could not decide whether to sweat or to go dry as paper. Worst of all was the thirst that did not sit in my mouth, but behind my eyes, deep in the skull. A thirst that made me dream of cool wells and cracked buckets. I heard my mother moving through the house with a purpose that frightened me more than the illness. Her steps did not wander. She did not pause to scold a child or to sigh at a broken hinge. Her feet went straight from the stove to the table, from the table to my room, from my room to the doorway, and back again. That is how a woman walks when she is trying to hold something together with nothing but will. At some point, morning, evening, I could not have told you, I felt a spoon touch my lips. Something bitter slid across my tongue, and I wanted to turn my head away, but the neck would not obey. I think it was willow bark or some mixture the older women believed in. Our town was full of such remedies, half learned, half inherited. Later, I learned the names of medicines the way educated people speak them, but then it was simply, "This will help," said with a tight face. There were voices at the foot of my bed. My father's voice was there too, stripped of its usual rough ease. He asked questions as if questions could bargain with God. My mother answered in short pieces, like someone breaking kindling. "She was well yesterday." She shook in the kitchen. "She cannot keep water." I heard my own name said more than once, and each time it sounded as if it belonged to someone else. I want you to understand a strange thing about being near the edge, whether the edge is death or only the imitation of it. Your mind does not rise to poetry. It clings to the smallest, plainest facts. I remember the smell of vinegar on a cloth as my mother pressed it to my brow. I remember the scratch of the sheet against my heel. I remember, absurdly, the creak of the third floorboard by the door, always the third, because my father could never be bothered to fix it. And even in sickness, I thought, fix that board, fix it, fix it. The doctor came when he could. He was not a villain, not some careless brute. He was a man with too many calls and too little certainty, and he had the look of someone who had learned to keep his face calm, no matter what he saw. When he touched my wrist, I felt nothing, no pressure, no warmth. Yet I knew, in the way you know you're being watched, that his fingers were there. He lifted my eyelids. Light stabbed through me, and then the darkness closed again. "He's saying she'll mend," my father said to someone, hope already trying to climb into his voice. But hope is a thing that can be denied without anyone meaning to deny it. The doctor spoke quietly, and my mother's answer was quieter still. There was talk of my breathing being shallow, of my skin being hot, of my heart doing something irregular. I felt myself drifting out while they spoke over me, as if my body were a problem to be solved at a table. Then came the part that has always been hardest to explain without sounding as though I want you to gasp on cue. I do not. I am not selling you terror. I am giving you what I carried. There was a moment, again, I cannot swear whether it was the next day or the day after, when the fever broke. People think that means relief. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it means the fire goes out because there is nothing left to burn. The shaking stopped. The sweat cooled. My limbs, which had been heavy as soaked wool, became light and far away. I could not feel my hands. I could not feel my feet. I could not feel the bed beneath me. It was as if I were floating in a room that had no corners. I tried to swallow. My throat would not move. I tried to call for my mother, because in the muddle of sickness I suddenly wanted her with a child's hunger, but my mouth would not open. Panic arrived, not as a scream, but as a cold, sharp awareness. I was awake inside a body that would not announce it. I listened with all I had. Voices came and went, muffled at first and then close. I caught my mother's sob, one harsh intake she tried to smother, because she was a woman who believed crying should be private like prayer. I heard my father say, "No," in a voice that did not sound like his own. I heard a chair scrape the floor. Someone touched my cheek. A hand, rough, probably my father's, as if he needed to confirm the fact of skin. Someone else lifted my wrist again, fingers pressed. The pressure was firm enough that if I had been well, I would have felt it. I felt only the idea of it, like a memory of sensation. The doctor spoke a sentence that I did not catch whole, but I caught the end of it, something about gone, something about can't suffer now. My mother said, "Wait." It was a small word, but it held the whole house. There was a pause, and in that pause I strained for any way to show them. A twitch, a sigh, a tear. Nothing came. It is a terrible lesson to learn how little you command your own body when it decides to betray you. My mother's voice hardened the way it did when she argued over money or defended a child. "We will keep her," she said. "We will keep her until morning. The earth can wait." If the story ended there, it would be a kinder story. It did not end there. Night passed in pieces. I remember candlelight flickering behind my eyelids. I remember the whisper of skirts. I remember, faintly, someone praying at the bedside. My aunt, perhaps, with her fierce temper turned toward heaven. And then sometime near dawn, the house changed. The air changed. The voices changed. They began to speak as though the waiting had been granted and spent. The doctor returned, or perhaps he had never gone far. There was another examination, more hurried this time. A hand at my throat, a hand at my chest, a muttered phrase about no response. My mother made a sound that was not a sob now, but a surrender, like a door being closed very gently so it would not slam. And I, inside myself, screamed in complete silence. I felt them wash me. The cloth moved over my skin, warm at first, then cooling as the water cooled. They turned my body as if it belonged to a doll. My hair was combed. My nightdress was changed for something clean. The small scar on my left palm, the snapped needle, was rubbed, and I felt nothing. That emptiness convinced them more than any doctor's word. When my mother leaned close, I smelled lye on her fingers and the faint sweetness of boiled fruit from the kitchen, still clinging to the house despite everything. She kissed my forehead. Her lips trembled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and I knew she meant it in a way that went deeper than illness. She meant she was sorry for every sharp word she had ever spoken to me, for every time she had asked too much of my back and my hands. She meant she was sorry she could not pull me back. I wanted to tell her she still could, but the only thing my body could do was lie there, perfectly, convincingly still, while the living began to arrange my leaving. By the time they laid me out in the front room, the house had taken on that careful hush people think is respect. It is partly respect, yes, but it is also fear. Fear of doing or saying the wrong thing in the presence of what cannot answer you back. The curtains were drawn to soften the light. A sheet was pinned where it would not slip. Someone, my aunt again, I think, set a bowl of salt on the table as if salt could hold off decay by the force of tradition alone. I lay in the middle of it, dressed in a plain gown my mother had kept for Sundays, my hands folded and tied lightly with ribbon so they would not fall open. I knew that ribbon. I'd seen it in the sewing basket. It was meant for trimming a bonnet. She had chosen it because it was what we had. This is what I mean when I say the past was not made of grand gestures. It was made of small, practical decisions that pressed people forward like a crowd. The day did not stop because I was thought to be dead. Water still had to be drawn. Bread still had to be baked, and there were rules, spoken and unspoken, that drove the rest. The heat of late summer, the worry of keeping a body too long, the expense of delay, the simple fact that neighbors expected a funeral, not an uncertainty. I listened to them move around me as if I were a piece of furniture. Footsteps on boards, a chair shifted, a kettle lifted. My mind, trapped behind its own unmoving face, began to learn the house by sound alone. The creaking third board, the clink of a spoon against a cup, the whisper of my mother's dress hem as she crossed the room. People came in pairs because grief is easier when shared. They spoke in lowered voices, and the lowered voices made it worse. At least in ordinary speech you can interrupt. In whispers, you're already excluded. "She looks peaceful," a woman said. I wanted to strike her for her comfort. "She was a good girl," someone answered. That was true, and it burned. I had been good the way a table is good, useful, steady, taken for granted. I had wanted quietly to be more than that. I had wanted to choose something for myself. I had wanted to marry, yes, but on my own terms, with my own heart, not as a bargain between families. Those wants rose in me like a hand reaching up through water, and still my body gave them no path. At some point, a man's voice joined the room, and the timbre of it, careful, held back, told me it was the undertaker or a carpenter pressed into the work. In smaller towns, the trades overlapped. The same hands that made your cradle might make your coffin. I heard the scrape of wood being shifted in the hallway, the faint rasp of a plane, the soft thud of a hammer striking a nail not too hard, as if even nails ought to be quiet. My mother spoke to him in the kitchen. I could not catch every word, but I caught the shape of her bargaining. Plain, sturdy, not too dear. She named what we could pay. She did not ask for ornament. She could not. It would have been an insult to the living. When she came back into the front room, she stood beside me for a long time without touching me. I could feel her presence the way you feel a fire you cannot see, a warmth at the edge of your skin. Then she sat, and I heard her breathing, slow in, slow out, like she was counting herself through it. "There's something I never told you," she murmured. and the words made my mind jolt upright. Confessions have that power, because I thought it would be foolish, because I thought you'd laugh. She did not look around. She spoke as if the room were empty, as if the whole town were not outside waiting on custom. When you were small, she said, you stopped breathing once, just for a moment. You were blue at the mouth. Your father went white as flour. Her voice faltered. And then you gasped and came back and wailed so loud the dog hid under the table. I remembered none of it. Or perhaps I remembered it only as a shadow, a cold gap in the earliest part of my life. I never liked how still you could get, she went on, and now her voice sharpened, not at me, but at her own fear. Even when you slept as a babe, you slept like a stone. I used to put my hand under your nose just to feel the breath. She swallowed. I did it yesterday. I did it this morning. I felt nothing. I wanted to weep, not for myself, for her, for that hand held under my nose, desperate for a sign, and the sign refusing to come. The door opened again, and more people arrived. The minister, perhaps, or a deacon. Someone read a verse, and I listened to words I had heard all my life. Dust to dust, earth to earth. Words that always sounded calm until you were the one being offered up to them. The cadence of Scripture is a sort of lullaby, and for a terrible moment I felt myself slipping, not into death, but into a drowsy acceptance that frightened me more than the coffin itself. I forced my mind to stay sharp by naming things, the smell of lye on my mother's fingers, the sweetness of preserves, the sour of sweat in the room, the coolness at my wrists where the ribbon pressed. Then came the first true change, the moment my body was no longer simply displayed, but prepared to be removed. They lifted me. A living person is heavy in a different way than a dead one, because a living body resists without meaning to. Mine did not. They took that as proof. My head lolled, and someone murmured, "Careful," not because I was alive, but because it would be indecent for my neck to show too much slack. They carried me toward the hallway where the new wood waited. As they moved, the sound shifted. The room behind grew distant. The hallway's echo came close. My dress brushed a door frame. A cool draft touched my ankles. I tried, with all the stubbornness I had ever used to scrub a pot clean, to make one finger bend. Nothing. The lid was near. I could smell fresh-cut pine, sharp and clean, a scent that belonged to barns and lumber yards, not to the end of a girl's life. Someone set me down inside. The boards beneath me were hard. The space was narrow. My arms, folded at my chest, pressed against me in a way that felt suddenly intimate, as if I were holding myself. A nail clicked into place somewhere above my ear, and with that sound so small and ordinary, I understood something that has stayed with me longer than any sermon. The worst moments in a life are not always announced. Sometimes they arrive quietly, with a tool in a man's hand, while everyone in the room believes they're doing what must be done. The first nails did not sound like violence. That is what people never understand when they imagine it. They think there is a great banging, a struggle, a grand interruption of the proper order. But the men who sealed that lid were careful men. They tapped the iron in with the restraint you use around an infant's crib. Gentle, measured, almost respectful. Tap, tap, tap. Each stroke placed another thin certainty between my lungs and the room where my mother still sat with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles must have ached. When the last corner was fastened, the world became the size of my own face. Cloth lay near my mouth. I could smell starch in it, and the pine was everywhere, raw and clean. The air inside was not gone, not at first. There was enough to make the mind hopeful, and hope in a box is a cruel sort of thing. They lifted the coffin again. The motion told me more than my ears did, the slight tilt as they cleared the threshold, the pause while someone adjusted his grip, the little sway as they found a walking rhythm. My head rolled to one side and rested against the wood. The hardness of it should have hurt. It did not. That was the most frightening proof of all. That sensation had left me like a house emptied of furniture, leaving only walls. Outside, sound returned in a different shape. In the open air, voices scatter. I heard them as a blur. Murmurs, a cough, the faint squeal of a wheel on a cart. A horse stamped once, impatient, and the vibration traveled up through the coffin's boards as if the animal had placed its hoof on my ribs. Someone said my name. It was my father. I knew it by the way his voice thickened around it, like a man trying not to swallow a stone. Easy now, he told the men carrying me, as if the comfort were for them. Then lower, so low I almost missed it. Forgive me, little bird. He had called me that when I was small, though he stopped as I grew older, embarrassed by tenderness. If I could have moved then, if one hand could have reached through the lid, what would I have done? I do not think I would have clawed. I think I would have touched his wrist. Just that. A single human proof. They set me down onto the cart, and the jolt made my teeth click together, that I felt, barely, like the memory of cold. It sparked a fierce clarity. I was not gone. I was not an idea. I was a body that still registered impact, still carried weight. The wheels began to turn. Gravel shifted under them. The town's noises, distant hammering, a dog barking, children calling, came and went like passing clouds. Life went on around my box. That knowledge tightened something inside me. It made my mind press against my helplessness, the way a trapped moth beats itself against a lantern. We reached the churchyard, or perhaps it was the small cemetery beyond it. I did not see, but I knew by the change in sound. Open space, fewer walls, the hush that comes from grass and old stones. The men paused and set me down. A prayer began above me, the minister's voice carried by habit. He spoke of peace. He spoke of rest. He spoke of the Lord gathering his own. I wanted to bite through the words. Rest was the last thing I needed. I needed movement. I needed to command my tongue, my fingers, anything at all. Time behaved strangely then. Each breath felt like a slow sip of air from a narrow straw. I could not tell whether minutes passed or only heartbeats. I listened to the prayer end. I listened to someone sob. One of the women, perhaps my aunt, fierce in all things except this. I listened to my mother's silence, which was heavier than sobbing. Then came the sound that changed everything, the first shovel. It struck earth with a dull, intimate thud. Not the ring of metal on stone, but the sound of a mouth closing. Dirt scraped, dirt lifted, dirt fell. The first handful rattled against the coffin like rain against a roof. My mind recoiled as if the dirt were hitting my own skin. That, you see, is when fear becomes a physical thing. It stops being a thought and becomes a pressure in the chest, a tightening in the throat. My body still would not move, but something else inside me woke fully, some animal part that does not ask permission. I tried again to bend a finger. I tried to make a toe curl. I tried to force a breath deep enough to shift my ribs, to thump the wood from within. Nothing, nothing, nothing. The dirt kept coming, and with each layer the outside world dimmed. The prayer had ended, the murmurs faded, and even the shovels began to sound farther away, as if they were working at the end of a long hallway. I heard someone say, "That's enough," and another answer, "A little more." The words were ordinary. The act was final. When the last earth fell, there was a silence so complete it felt like a substance. The coffin did not merely hold me. It separated me from all measure. No wind, no footsteps, no distant cart. Only the faintest creak of wood as the soil settled and found its weight. I did not faint. I did not drift off into some mercy. My mind stayed lit, bright, and trapped. At first I counted breaths. It was something to do, something to prove I still had time. 1 breath, 2, 3, each one smaller than the last because the air was already changing. It grew warm, sour, touched with the taste of my own mouth. I tried to remember every story I had ever heard of people waking in graves. There were always embellishments, scratch marks on lids, screams heard by the night watch, bells tied to fingers. In our town, we had no such devices, no fancy contraptions for rich folks' fears. We had only pine boards and prayer and haste. And then, in the midst of that remembering, another thought rose, cold, precise, and horribly practical. If no one could hear me, I would have to do something that did not require being heard. I do not know what made the next sensation possible. Perhaps the fever's grip loosened in that deep, cool dark. Perhaps terror itself jolted my nerves awake. Perhaps God, if he was watching, decided I had not yet earned the earth. But I felt faintly a twitch in my right hand. It was so small you would not have noticed it in daylight. Inside the coffin, it was a trumpet blast. I willed it again. The ribbon at my wrists pressed. My fingers shuddered, as if wakened from sleep. A thin sound escaped my throat. Not a word, not even a moan, more like a breath catching on cloth. I swallowed, and the swallow scraped like sand. I lay there, buried, listening to my own fragile movements like a person listening for a friend's footstep in a storm. My fingertips brushed the ribbon, and in that tiny contact I found a fact to hold on to. If my fingers could move, then my arms might move. If my arms could move, then I could work. And if I could work, even in this narrow wooden room, then the story was not finished yet. My fingers, once they had learned they were allowed to live again, did not want to stop. They trembled against the ribbon like a moth against thread, each small motion making the knot rasp softly in the cramped dark. The air was already different, warmer, thicker, tasting of pine and my own breath. And that change made me hurry in my mind even while my body still moved like a thing half asleep. You may think the first act would be clawing at the lid. It was not. A lid is a proud enemy. It asked for strength I did not yet possess. Ribbon, though. Ribbon was made for women's hands. Ribbon has a weakness. It can be worried, teased, coaxed. My mother's choice of that little strip of cloth meant for a bonnet became my first door. I pressed my wrists together, then apart, testing. The ribbon had been tied with care, not cruelty. It was meant to keep my hands from falling open in death, not to bind a living prisoner. The knot was simple, the kind you make when you're in a hurry and do not expect the thing to matter. I shifted my right thumb, rubbing it along the place where cloth crossed cloth, searching for the smallest looseness, In the beginning, I had no nails, no teeth, no proper tools, only skin and patience. But patience is a tool, too, when there's nothing else. I worked the knot as I had once worked a stubborn stain, and I tried to keep my thoughts from racing ahead of my hands. Fear spends strength like a drunk spends coin. I could not afford that. The first victory was almost insulting, a tiny slack, a fraction of a finger's breadth. Yet that slack felt like a window opening. I drew one wrist down, one up, and the ribbon creaked. Another rub, another pull. My thumb slipped under a loop, and the cloth gave, not all at once, but in a reluctant little sigh. When one hand came free, it did not leap to action. It lay against my chest, heavy and unfamiliar, as if it belonged to a stranger. I closed my fingers slowly, listening to the joints click. Pain arrived, not sharp, but deep and aching, and I welcomed it the way you welcome a voice after a long silence. Pain meant I was present. I brought that free hand to my throat, the cloth near my mouth, some folded kerchief set there out of modesty or habit, was damp with my own breath. I tugged it away, and the air hit my lips more directly. It was not good air, but it was less stifled. I forced myself to take a longer breath. It rasped. It came with a thin, involuntary sound, like a whimper you cannot swallow. I did not call out. I considered it. Oh, I considered it with the desperation of a drowning person seeing a hand on shore. But I knew too much about Earth. Sound does not travel kindly through packed soil. Even if someone stood above, even if my father lingered, even if my mother's caution had brought them back to listen, my voice would be a moth beating at stone. I could not waste what little air I had on hope that required another person to be in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. So I turned my mind to what I could do alone. My free hand moved over the inside of the coffin. The wood was close, close enough that my knuckles brushed it without my arm fully straightening. I felt the grain, the ridges left by a hurried plane. There were no soft linings, no satin. We were not that sort of family. The plainness, which would have seemed shameful at a richer funeral, was now a mercy. Cloth might have muffled my touch. Plain wood told the truth to my fingers. I found the seam where lid met side. I pressed along it, searching for any place where the boards were less obedient. The nails, those careful, respectful nails, held firm. But the coffin had been made quickly. Quick work always leaves one small flaw. That is the bargain. Near my left shoulder, I found a spot where the lid did not sit perfectly flush. The gap was no wider than a matchstick, but to my mind it was a crack in a fortress wall. I slid a fingertip into it. The edge bit my skin. I gritted my teeth and pushed farther. Splinter pricked me and drew a hot bead of blood that I could feel but could not see. I did not pull away. I let the pain anchor me. The first time I tried to pry, nothing happened. My arm shook. The wood held. My breath grew quick, and with quick breath came a rising panic, the old animal part of me stamping and bucking. I stopped. That is important. People think bravery is pressing on. Sometimes bravery is stopping before you ruin yourself. I forced the next breaths to be slow, even if they were shallow. I listened. In the silence of the grave, you can hear your own heart, as if it is someone knocking from the next room. Mine was fast, then faster. I told it, foolishly as though it were a child, that it must behave. When the pounding steadied, I tried again. but not with raw force. I changed the angle. I pressed my shoulder into the opposite side of the coffin, making my body a brace. I wedged 2 fingers into the crack, not one, and used my wrist like a lever. A lever is a poor woman's advantage. It turns small strength into larger effect. The same principle as a broom handle under a heavy pot. The same principle as a plank under a rock. The wood complained, not much, a faint creak. But a creak is motion, and motion is possibility. I worked in tiny measures. Pry, rest, breathe. Pry, rest, breathe. The coffin answered with a series of reluctant sounds, each one like a sentence spoken through clenched teeth. The crack widened enough for a thin thread of air to change against my fingers. That air was no cleaner than what I had, but it was different. It carried the faint, cold smell of soil. It was proof of the world outside my box. Then another trouble announced itself. Earth. As soon as the lid lifted even the slightest, weight pressed down from above, soil, packed and settled, bore on the boards. I could feel it in the way the wood flexed. The earth was not just a blanket. It was a hand on my throat. For a moment, despair returned so suddenly it nearly made me laugh. What did I think I was doing? Opening a door under a mountain? But even mountains have weaknesses. Earth can shift. Earth can fall. If it falls, it must fall somewhere. I thought of our cellar after a flood, the way mud slides and pools. I thought of the riverbank when it gives way under a boot. Soil is heavy, but it is not one solid thing. It is countless small things that move when invited. So I changed my plan again. Instead of trying to lift the lid wide, I tried to make a small pocket. Just enough room to move, enough room to breathe, enough room to push a hand through and feel above. I pried until the crack could admit the tips of 3 fingers, then 4. Dirt began to trickle in, a soft spill that pattered against my cheek and fell onto my chest. It was cold. It made my skin crawl with an instinct older than thought. I held my breath as the first grain slid into my mouth. I coughed once, harshly, and the cough stole air I could not spare. I pressed my lips shut and breathed through my nose, careful, controlled. My mind, in a strange way, became calm. Not because I was safe, no, because work leaves little room for terror's theatrics. The dirt kept sifting in, and I let it to a point. I used my free hand to sweep it down toward my hips, packing it away from my face, making a crude space near my head. Each sweep was like shoveling in reverse. Each sweep reminded me of all the mornings I had risen before light to do chores that did not care whether I was tired. I had cursed those mornings. Now they were training. At last I had a gap large enough to slide my whole hand out. I pushed upward into soil that resisted, and then gave, as if I were thrusting my arm into a sack of meal. The pressure was immense, and my shoulder screamed with it. But my fingers found a truth. Above the lid there was not empty air. There was earth, and the earth could be moved. That knowledge did not save me yet. It did something more necessary. It gave me a direction. And with direction, I could spend the next breath on purpose instead of pleading. Once I understood that my hand had found not a wall but a substance, my thoughts narrowed to a worker's simplicity. Move this, then move it again. I did not allow myself to picture the surface, nor my mother's face, nor any salvation. Imagination would have been a weight in that small space. What I needed was rhythm. The earth above the lid pressed down on my arm like a living thing. It was not the clean soil of a garden, sifted and kind. It was graveyard earth. mixed with stones and roots and the remnants of old burials that no one spoke of. My fingers met resistance, then a slight give, then more resistance. Each push hurt my shoulder in a way that made it feel foreign, as if the joint belonged to someone else. That pain was a tether. Without it, I might have drifted off into the warm, deadly comfort of not trying. I learned quickly that I could not simply thrust upward. The soil would fall back at once, reclaiming whatever small hollow I had made. So, as in all things, I thought of work I knew. In the wash house, when we beat dirt from heavy cloth, we did not strike one spot until the fabric tore. We moved our blows, lifted and shifted, letting water carry some filth away while our arms dealt with the rest. Here there was no water, but there was the same principle. Do not fight the whole burden head on. Worry at its edges. Let each small dislodging make the next easier. I bent my wrist and dug sideways, not straight up, curling my fingers like a claw, pulling soil toward my chest where I could sweep it down past my ribs. It slid around my body, filling the lower part of the coffin, creeping into the folds of my gown. Every handful I displaced from above settled somewhere else against me, cold and heavy, but it freed a breath's worth of space near my face. Breath by breath, fingerful by fingerful, that was the measure of my world. The air grew worse as I worked. It thickened, took on a sweet, sick edge, like fruit left too long in a closed pantry. My lungs began to burn, not in the sharp way of running, but in a deep, smoldering ache. I paused more often, forcing each inhalation to be slow, refusing the wild animal urge to gasp. A gasp would have spent me for nothing. In those pauses, my mind wandered against my will. I thought of my mother's hands, red from lye and water. I thought of my father's boots by the door, dust clinging to them from the very earth that now pinned me. I thought of the neighbor boy pulled from the river, blue and still on the table. Was I like him now, or was I something in between, a borrowed soul who had not yet been claimed? Fear tried to rise again, sly and many-voiced. It told me this was foolishness, that people did not come back from under the ground without help, that even if I clawed my way into some narrow pocket, I would simply die slower and dirtier. It whispered that surrender would be quieter, more fitting, more acceptable. I did not argue with fear. I had no breath for arguments. Instead, I answered it with motion. My other arm, until then pinned and sluggish, began to wake. The blood I had forced through my body with all that struggling reached it at last in a warmth that was almost painful. I flexed the fingers one by one, feeling the prickle of returning life. Then I brought that arm up across my chest to join the first in its labor. With two hands, the work changed its nature. I could lift and push, then scoop and pull, making a crude tunnel above my head. Soil poured around my forearms like water, heavy but willing to move. When the weight became too much, I shifted, tucking my chin, angling my shoulders, turning my body into the narrowest shape it could manage. At some point in that blind struggle, I heard something I had not heard since before the lid closed, a sound from outside. It was faint, almost imagined, a distant rumble, perhaps a cart on the road, perhaps thunder. It might even have been my own blood pounding in my ears, dressed up as hope. I froze, listening so hard it hurt. Nothing followed, no shout, no step, no shovel. The grave remained what it was, a solitary place. But that brief suggestion of noise reminded me of a simple truth. The world was still out there, whether it saw me or not, Seasons would change. The river would rise and fall. Children would be born and named and scolded. My own life might end in that box, but life itself was not finished. For reasons I cannot fully explain, that knowledge stiffened my resolve. If the world insisted on going on, I would insist on trying to rejoin it. My fingers struck something that was not soil. A root, thin but tough, ran through the earth above me like a nerve. I curled my hand around it and pulled. It did not give, but it did something better. It anchored me. Holding that small living thing, I could use my arm like a lever again, hauling my body upward by inches while my legs, sluggish but no longer entirely numb, pushed against the coffin's bottom. The boards creaked. They were not meant for this movement. From below, from within. Each shift produced a protesting groan. For a wild instant, I feared the wood would snap, the earth rush in fully, and I would be packed so tightly there would be no room even for thought. But the coffin held. Poor as we were, the carpenter had done his job well. I do not know how long that climbing took. Time down there was not measured by clocks. It was measured by breaths stolen and breaths won. I would work until my head swam and a roaring filled my ears. Then I would lie as still as I dared, letting the faint, cooler threads of air in my crude tunnel soothe the fire in my chest. In those pauses, I sometimes slipped sideways into strange, thin dreams, standing at the riverbank with my bare feet in the mud, or shelling peas at the table while my mother hummed. Each time, the rasp of soil against my skin dragged me back, and I would realize with a small, fierce joy that I was still able to be dragged anywhere at all. Little by little, the weight above my head lightened. My hands met less resistance before they found emptiness. The soil came away more easily, falling down past my shoulders instead of packing hard. A freshness crept into the air, not clean yet, not open, but sharpened with the hint of sky. It carried, very faintly, the scent of grass. My right hand reached farther than before and did not meet earth. It waved in nothingness for an instant that felt longer than many days. Then my fingertips brushed something cool and yielding, air itself, with no grit between us. I pushed upward, widening the hole, feeling the edge crumble. Pebbles rolled. A small cascade of dirt slid back, filling part of the space I had made, but not all of it. There was now a place where my hand could close on nothing. The first true lungful of that changed air was like fire and ice together. I coughed, a great tearing cough that shook my whole body and sent more soil cascading into the coffin. For a terrifying moment, I could not draw the next breath. My chest spasmed. My throat seized around the mix of dirt and new air. Then something loosened. I gasped again, ragged but deeper. The world above felt suddenly very close, as if the sky had leaned down to inspect the stubborn thing refusing to stay buried. I pushed my arm through the opening as far as it would go, up past the wrist, the elbow, until the cool air licked at skin that had not known anything but wood and darkness for what felt like forever. My fingers spread wide, reaching for nothing in particular, simply reaching. If anyone had been standing there, they might have taken that hand for a ghost's. In truth, it was the plainest, most earthly thing I have ever done, to insist, in the most literal sense, on having a place among the living. Below, the coffin groaned again, its seams complaining. Above, a small shower of earth slid down my arm and into the box. Between those two pressures, I moved my other hand up to join the first, seeking a grip on the lip of my own grave. I had come far enough that there was only one direction left to go. Breaking the surface of one's own grave is not like the tales say. There is no clean emergence, no sudden sitting up as if from troubled sleep. It is more like forcing yourself through the narrow mouth of a sack that someone has already knotted. My arms, once they found the edge of the hole, shook so hard I thought they might refuse me at the last. The soil crumbled under my fingers. Grass roots tangled with my nails. Each small pull lifted my chest a little from the coffin and let more earth tumble down around my hips. Cold air lay against my forearms like water from a well. It made the sweat on my skin sting and then chill. I hooked my elbows over the edge of the hole and tried to wriggle upward, but my body was heavy with weakness. For a moment I hung there, half in, half out. My ribs caught on the lip of the grave like a garment snagged on a nail. I made a sound then, the first true sound since they had closed the lid, a hoarse, torn cry that hardly deserved the name. It was not a word. It was the noise a creature makes when it finds the fence lower than it feared, but higher than it can clear. The effort stole my breath in a rush. I sagged back, and a spill of dirt slid over my face, filling my mouth, burning my nose. The taste was bitter and old with a hint of iron. I spat as best I could and pressed my cheek against the cooler soil near the opening, stealing what air it would give. I could not go back. There was no down to return to, only more suffocation and a slower, quieter end. All that remained was up, and up demanded more than my arms alone could offer. I bent my knees, those stubborn, numb joints, and kicked against the coffin's floor. The wood answered with a dull thud, and the jolt ran through the whole box, shaking more earth loose from above. Some of it fell into the space I had carved, making my passage narrower. Some of it slid aside, filling the hollow where my legs had been. The second kick was better aimed. My toes found a seam between planks and pressed. The force drove my shoulders higher, scraping skin from my arms as they slid along the grave's sides. I cried out again, not from fear this time, but from the simple outrage of flesh being asked to do more than it had left. Pain flared, hot and clean. It did not stop me. Pain, I had learned, can be a rope as much as a chain. I do not know whether the next sound I heard came from my own struggle or from the world beyond me, but it startled my heart into a gallop. A stone skittered nearby, close, then closer, then stopped. Perhaps the earth had shifted under my efforts. Perhaps a small rock had rolled down from one of the older graves. In the quiet of that ground, even such a tiny noise felt like company. Help, I tried to say. The word came out as a rasping breath, torn apart by dirt and dryness. If anyone stood within 10 paces, they might have taken it for wind or for nothing at all. Still I tried again, pushing air through my ruined throat. Help! The second attempt was no stronger than the first, but it proved I still had will enough to ask. I gathered myself for one more effort. There's a point at which the body, cornered, spends everything without keeping any coin in reserve. It was not heroism. It was desperation. I twisted my hips, driving one shoulder higher than the other, and used that awkward angle to lever my upper body farther out of the hole. My right arm flailed for purchase and caught on something, a tuft of stubborn grass clinging to the grave's edge. I seized it as if it were a rope thrown from heaven. The grass did not hold, of course. It tore under my grip. but the motion of pulling against it threw my weight forward. Suddenly my chest was over the rim, then my stomach, then my thighs, dragging like a sack behind me. I slid, half crawling, half falling, onto the damp surface of the graveyard and lay sprawled across the disturbed mound of my own burial. The sky above me was not the wide blue I had sometimes imagined while suffocating below. It was a dull, clouded gray, as indifferent as a pewter plate. Still, it was sky. The air, cool and open, rushed into me in greedy gulps. Each breath hurt, scraping my throat raw, but hurt or no, I could not stop taking them. I coughed until my ribs ached. Dark flecks, earth, old blood, phlegm, spattered the ground. My fingers dug into the grass without meaning to, as if testing that it was real. I could have stayed there, I think, if no one had found me, and simply breathed until my body chose its own end. But people do not lie long in graveyards without attracting notice. Even the quietest places have eyes. A shriek split the air, sharp as a kettle's whistle. I flinched, expecting some new danger, and turned my head by inches toward the sound. A girl, young, perhaps the undertaker's daughter or a neighbor sent with flowers, stood frozen a little way off, her hands clapped to her mouth. Her eyes were so wide I could see the whites even through my blurred vision. For a heartbeat we stared at one another. To her, I must have looked like exactly what I was not. A corpse clawed back from under the soil, gown filthy, hair plastered with dirt, skin pale but streaked with sweat and earth. To me, she was a miracle in a plain dress. She bolted. I tried to call after her, to say her name if I knew it, or any name at all. The only sound that came was a cracked croak. I pulled my elbows under me, trying to rise, and managed only to lift my head a hand's breadth before dizziness slammed me back down. The world tilted and swam. Graves leaned at odd angles. The churchyard fence seemed farther away than it had any right to be. Voices floated on the air, distant at first, then nearer. Men shouting, a woman crying, the quick beat of running feet. The girl had done what panic taught her. She had run to tell others. Whether they would come with crosses and prayers or with rope and shovels, I could not guess. Lord, have mercy, someone whispered, close enough that I felt the words more than heard them. Boots stopped near my head. I smelled leather, sweat, and the faint metallic scent of tools. A shadow fell over me, blocking the gray sky. She's moving, a man said. His voice shook. It was not the minister. It sounded like the undertaker, the same careful tone I had heard when he measured the living for the dead. Don't touch it, another hissed. It's a sign. It can't be. His words drifted into muttering. I forced my head up again, fighting the weight of my own skull. My eyes met the undertaker's. His face, usually composed into a professional sorrow, had lost all arrangement. He looked as if he were staring at a fire where there should be water. My lips were stiff. My tongue felt too large for my mouth. I am not gone. The sentence fell apart halfway through, but the meaning, I think, reached him. His gaze wavered, then sharpened. Get her a blanket, he said, more to the air than to anyone in particular. And water. For the love of God, water. But she was buried, someone protested, crossing themselves. The doctor said, the doctor is not standing here looking at her, the undertaker snapped. There was fear in his voice. Yes, but there was also something else. The stubborn practicality of a man who has seen too many bodies to faint at one more, even if this one refuses its appointed role. Hands slid under my shoulders, careful but unsure. They lifted me enough to turn me on my side. Dirt cascaded from my hair and dress, pooling on the grass. A rough woolen blanket wrapped around me, scratching my skin, and the scratch felt better than any silk. A cup touched my lips. The first sip of water almost choked me. My throat rebelled, unused to anything but parched air. I coughed, then tried again, and the second swallow went down like a blessing. As the water moved through me, cold and real, the murmurs around me multiplied. Some voices trembled with awe, some with suspicion, some with plain old fear. Witchcraft, miracle, mistake. The words bobbed over my head like driftwood on a river. It would have been easy to be offended, to feel anger at their doubt. But in that moment, I felt only one clear, solid thing. Exhaustion so deep it seemed to reach my bones. Someone said, "Fetch your mother." At that, my heart lurched harder than it had during the whole climb. I tried to sit up, to see the path down which my mother would come, but the blanket and the hands and my own weakness pressed me back. "Please," I rasped, my voice barely more than breath. "Tell her." Slow. I did not want my mother to see me as the girl in the graveyard had first seen me, as a thing that should not be. I wanted her to have a moment, even just one, to prepare her heart. No one answered that plea. They were too busy arguing over what I was. Above their dispute, the sky remained the same mild, indifferent gray. My fingers, curled in the blanket, found a scrap of ribbon tangled there, stiff, dirty, the very piece that had once bound my hands in the coffin. I held it between thumb and forefinger, feeling its frayed edge, and understood in a quiet, private way that my work was not done. Escaping the grave was one kind of struggle. Facing the living would be another. They carried me from the churchyard not on a bier, as they had carried me there, but in a muddled, hurried fashion, as if they could not quite decide whether I was something fragile or something dangerous. The blanket scratched my throat each time I tried to lift my head. My limbs hung with an awful looseness that reminded me, unpleasantly, of how I had seen men haul sacks of grain. Useful burdens, but still burdens. I remember the doorway of the house more clearly than the path to it. The lintel, which had always seemed so solid, loomed above me like the edge of another box. For a moment I could not make myself cross under it. A child's thought rose up, wild and irrational. If they take you across, they can shut you in again, put you back where they think you belong. My hands twitched under the blanket, seeking edges. "Easy now," the undertaker murmured, misreading my flinch. "Mind the head." He was a cautious man. Habit would not let him bruise even a body that had, in his mind, already endured more than its share of insult. Inside, the air smelled of boiled linens and stale candle smoke. Death has its own housekeeping. They had set chairs back against the walls, left a basin near the front room, prepared to receive mourners for a longer vigil if needed. Now the house waited, suspended between those arrangements and whatever this new thing was. My mother was not in the front room. For a heartbeat, I thought they had kept my wild wish, that someone had thought to tell her gently first. Then I heard her footsteps from the kitchen, sharp and quick and unsteady, and knew there had been no gentleness in the news at all. She stopped in the doorway the way the girl had in the graveyard, as if some invisible line kept her from stepping over. Her hands, still damp from whatever task she had dropped, smeared water on her skirt. She took me in, the mud, the torn gown, the dirt in my hair, the waxy pallor no washing could hide in an hour. Her eyes changed in a way I do not know how to describe. I had seen them angry, hurt, amused, calculating. This was none of those. It was as if two versions of me, dead and living, had collided in her gaze and refused to settle. "Ma," I tried to say, and the word came out raw and broken like something dragged over stones. It was enough. She crossed the room in 3 strides. The blanket, the hands, the mutters of others fell away. There was only her, solid and smelling of lye and onions and something scorched on the stove. She dropped to her knees beside the pallet they had laid me on and put both hands on my face, one on each cheek, as if she could hold me in place by touch alone. "Cold," she whispered, then warm. Her thumbs moved, feeling for heat that had no business being there. She pressed her ear to my chest, listening for a heart that should have been silent. I lay there, letting her catalog me, and for the first time since my fever broke, I did not fight. I breathed because I had to. That was all. Behind her, someone cleared his throat. The doctor had arrived. He had the look of a man summoned from a meal, napkins still in one fist, professional composure hastily buttoned over surprise. He stepped around my mother with a care that was more about navigating her grief than about my frailty. "This is unexpected," he said, which has remained to this day the poorest sentence I have ever heard applied to a human soul sitting up from her own grave. My mother's head snapped up. "You said she was gone," she hissed, all the softness burned out of her voice. "You put your hand on her chest and told us." The doctor's jaw tightened. He was not a cruel man, but he was proud, and pride does not enjoy being dragged into the front room and shown its limits. "I examined her," he answered, each word clipped. "No breath, no pulse I could detect. The skin." He shook his head. "Anyone in my place would have said the same." "Anyone," my mother repeated, tasting the word as if it were spoiled. "But not everyone took my daughter to the earth. They might have gone on like that, circling blame and defending competence, but I could not bear to have the room filled with a quarrel that treated me like an object over which they fought." I lifted my hand. It felt as heavy as a skillet, and let it fall against my mother's sleeve. "Ma," I rasped, "please." The contact cut through her anger more sharply than any argument. She turned back to me, shoulders shaken, and whatever words she might have thrown at the doctor stayed behind her teeth. She swallowed them like bad medicine. When she spoke again, her voice was low. "Hush now," she said to me, as she had when I was a child, feverish with some lesser ailment. "We can talk later." Later. The word felt like a gift. The doctor bent to his work. He took my wrist between his fingers, this time holding it with a humility I had not seen on him before. His thumb pressed, seeking the flutter of life. It was there, but faint, like a bird's wing against glass. His brows knit. "How long?" he began, then stopped, correcting himself. "When did you return?" I wanted to answer properly. I wanted to tell him of the moments in the coffin. The breaths counted, the dirt shifted. I wanted to place each fact like a stone in a wall, so no one could later call this hysteria or a dream. My throat, however, had its own opinion about how many words it would allow. "Not gone," I said slowly, each sound shaped with effort. "Ever. I was here." His eyes flicked to mine at that, sharp and unsettled. "You remember?" I managed a nod. A murmur ran through the room. Some of the neighbors had not left. They hovered near the walls, drawn by equal parts concern and a taste for the unusual, as people always have been. At my nod, a woman crossed herself. Another whispered, "Lord preserve us." A man near the door muttered something about tales his grandfather used to tell of folk buried too soon. Those stories, once dismissed as fireside fancies, suddenly felt very close. The undertaker, standing with his hat crushed between his hands, cleared his throat. I did not fasten the lid until the doctor gave the word," he said, as if this detail might absolve him. "We did what we have always done." "Yes," I whispered, more to myself than to him. That's the trouble. My mother shot me a sharp look, worried I might be drifting into fever talk, but I was coldly, painfully clear. It had been no singular malice, no Gothic scheme. It was habits. It was haste. It was trust placed in a body of knowledge that, for all its instruments and measures, still sometimes mistook a quiet life for an ended one. For the next days, were they days? They blurred. I lived in a strange half-light between care and suspicion. My mother would not let me out of her sight. She fed me broth in small spoonfuls, scolded me for trying to sit up unaided, changed my linens with a gentleness that made my chest ache more than the coffin. At night, I woke to find her hand hovering near my face, palm open, feeling for breath as she had when I was a baby. Each time I would exhale a little louder, just to reassure her. Others were not so easily soothed. Some came to the house under the pretext of bringing food or offering help, but their eyes kept straying to my face, as if expecting to see some mark there, a sign of possession, a shadow of the grave that would prove this was not simply a mistake, but a story with moral horror attached. Children dared each other to peek through the window and then fled giggling, half afraid, half delighted. The minister visited once. He sat by the bed and regarded me with a solemn curiosity. "You have been granted a rare mercy," he said at last. "Many pray for more time. Few are given it so plainly." I wanted to tell him that mercy had felt very much like neglect, that being shut away alive did not taste like a blessing. Instead, I nodded, because I knew what he needed to see, a lesson, a narrative that fit into his sermons. "Perhaps," I managed, "it is also a warning." He leaned forward. "Of what, child?" "Of haste," I whispered. My voice was stronger now, but I chose the softness on purpose. Of certainty where there should be question, of how quickly we decide someone has finished their part in this world. He pursed his lips, weighing this. "We must have rituals," he said. "Without them, grief has nowhere to go." I knew he was right in his way, but my mind, still raw from remembering boards above my face, could not help adding silently, "and bodies, sometimes, have nowhere to return from." Word spread beyond our street, of course. Stories do not stay put, especially ones that brush against the edge between life and death. Some told it as a miracle, that I had been dead and called back. Others, more cautious, told it as a near miss, a physician's error. The cruelest version painted me as half something else, a thing that had tasted the grave and might not be entirely trustworthy among the living. It was that last whisper that began to stain my days. You see, surviving is one matter. Being accepted as truly holy among the living again is another. The first is the work of muscle and stubbornness. The second is the work of eyes and tongues and what they choose to see. Lying there, ribbon still wrapped in my fingers, I began to understand that my escape from the coffin had only brought me into a different kind of narrow box. The stories other people would build around me. And stories, as I had just learned in the hardest way, can bury a person as surely as earth.